Matt, good to see you.
Yeah,
If you finish your thought, we'll go back a little bit so people that are listening will have a
sure,
perspective.
sure. Yeah, it's good to see you, Michael. Thank you for having me back on. Yeah, and I didn't realize I was going to be talking about this, but um, this week in Politico, an economist had an article where he went through uh, the U.S. government's data on unemployment, wages, and really drilled into it and analyzed it. And things I think that we all knew, he put down in black and white, right? Really qualified what does the information really mean. And so when you're talking about the U.S. having a 3.5% unemployment rate, well, what does that entail? That entails, and this is something a lot of us know, but we just don't think about how it would affect, or how, has it affect. I shouldn't say a lot of us know. People assume the numbers are skewed, right? People assume that the unemployment data is off, and he shows that it really is. So he finds that we have a functional unemployment rate of 24% in this country, because the way the unemployment data is worked is that if you're making poverty wages and below, so if you're, I think the example he used, if you're not just unemployed, but you're homeless, and somebody gives you money to do an odd job, right? So I give a homeless guy $20 to rake the leaves on my yard. Uh, that counts as a full measure of employment for the period being reported, right? And so essentially, he does a great job of pulling out all the data that resides within these figures that show how these figures are corrupted, how these figures are false or not trustworthy, or they're lies. And the point being, of course, that I think a lot of people on the left, where I come from, who were very disappointed, to put it politely, with the Biden and the Harris campaigns, was this smugness that came from the Democratic Party that the economy was good, and that if you think the economy is not going well, you just don't understand it, right? You just don't have the smarts, you don't have the intelligence, you just don't have the wherewithal to understand how good the economy really is. So people who were suffering, people who were struggling, uh, yeah, it turns out that they were correct. And the Democratic Party was wrong about this, which, again, of course, we knew. But this article in Political really demonstrates how wrong they were. When it shows that the median wage in the U.S. is not 70,000, it's actually $53,000. And when you compare that then to what cost of living is, et cetera, it shows how hard things are economically for people, and for them people to be told, like, you just don't get it. No, you don't understand. You're not smart enough to be in tune with how good the economy actually is. That had a lot to do with people not voting for Harris, or people choosing to vote for Trump, or what have you.
Well, and that with Politico, did that come out after the whole USAID connection?
That came out, yeah, just in the last couple of
That's
days.
right.
I should try and look it up and find it. I retweeted it on X. Am I able to say that? Can I say retweet and X in the same sentence, or do I have to? I guess I reposted it on X just a couple days ago. But really good article. And again, everything. Folks who are listening to this, I know you guys know this, but it's just it's a good validation, and for a publication like Politico to put it out there so clearly is meaningful. So.
But for that to come out after all the ties to the USAID and the money that they were being allocated towards them and other media
Oh,
groups,
yeah.
it just it's like to your point, it makes a lot of sense. But when it's actually put out there, the transparency that you're seeing right now. First of all, I never thought this would happen. Talking domestically for a second, I keep going back to this conversation. I know you haven't listened to it, but I had with my friend Matt Smith a couple of days ago, where he was talking about. I'll give you kind of the top overview of it. Is this run on gold, right? This huge amount of gold that is coming back to the United States right now. Why? And what he was saying was, and I'm paraphrasing, but that this administration is getting ready to move us from the dollar potential from the fiat into a new financial system. And he was also talking about the sovereign wealth fund, how and Howard Lutnick was on an interview last year talking about, if they drill in Alaska, the
Right.
Anwar Reserve, I think it's called, where there's 19 million acres of potential for oil. And they could put that in the sovereign wealth fund. They could put TikTok in the wealth fund, sovereign wealth fund. So all these things, showing the transparency to expose, say, our system is not working any longer. And that's where I'm in my mind. I'm like, okay, why are they showing all this now? I mean,
Yeah.
all of a sudden, this is all like cracking open. They're talking about Ron Paul auditing the Fed. I mean, they've been saying that for years.
Right. I
And
think Ron Paul's written books about that.
but now it's like legitimately potential to happen. Why now? So it just where we're at. What a remarkable time that we're in. And yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
So with what you're saying about Politico, it's like now it's all exposing. Like the employment numbers aren't real. Like everything is just a
Right.
big fugazi, Matt. Like
It is. Everything is, and I think people shocked to see that political subscriptions and other subscriptions cost 10, 12, $15,000, and that our government purchases those willingly. And that's, Bloomberg does a similar type of program. Maybe you should do that, Michael, right? Have the Mike and a Coffee Pro Edition or Government Edition or Corporate Edition or whatever and charge like an obscene rate. I remember when I was in the Pentagon, the first time I ever encountered this, I was in the Pentagon and um, somebody came by and they dropped off like a defense industry trade publication. And this would have been in 2002, probably late 2002. And I had never had one of those in my hands. I knew these things existed. And I don't know if it was on the back cover of this thing or maybe a guy I was working with said how much it costs, but it was, and I can't remember, of course, off the top of my head, 20 some odd years ago, how much it was. It was astounding what it was per a subscription per year for this thing. Talking probably, it's probably 15 or $2,000 a year for a subscription to this trade publication, which my office paid for, right? I was in the Secretary of Navy's office. We paid for this information, right? So, I mean, like, it's just amazing how that exists out there and how many people are unfamiliar with it, right? It's all part of this grift, and I don't think you can come from any side of the political spectrum and identify grift and corruption and rot and, for what those things are. And I think what we're seeing here with this administration, and even though I oppose most of what they're doing, I will give them credit in the sense that they are acting in a revolutionary manner, right? That this truly is a revolutionary administration, that they see something they don't like and they are going to change it. And in a way that we haven't seen since in my lifetime. Nixon certainly brought in a lot of different things. LBJ did, and of course FDR before that. But the amount of change that's occurring right now that is revolutionary, is astounding. And so I think these ideas that you're talking about gold, about a sovereign wealth fund, these are big ideas that are being brought in, and I think will try to be incorporated into the government, into our system, because that's what the people who've taken power believe to be necessary. And so, yeah, it is interesting times. There's no shortage of headlines. That's for sure. We can't even keep up with it, which I think is a tactic or of the administration, is throw so many things out there. I know in debating it's called gish galloping. I had learned that not too long ago, that when you're in a debate with somebody and you throw so many things out at them and they just can't keep up, they don't even know where to start to answer. That's called gish galloping, and that's essentially what I think we've seen these last 3 weeks been gish galloping by the administration, of just putting so much out there that people don't even know where to begin. You can't even so many things are done every day that in their own right should be the lead headline, and there's 9 or 10 of those things every day.
how do you counter gish galloping if you're getting gish galloped?
I'm trying to remember where I actually read about it, or where I saw it. I think you're supposed to just stay on your own message and not get thrown by it. I think that's what you're supposed to do. That if you get gish gallop, you're supposed to just stay on your point, maybe even point out that this is what your opponent is doing, and then try and just get back to your main message. But yeah.
I got to look that up after we get done. How do you? It's a counter because there's got to be a counter to it, right? With everything, there's
Yeah.
a reactive.
Yeah, I would assume that's what you do is that but I don't know. I never was formally trained in debate, and I don't even know why I would have come across that term. I'm trying to think back to the Harris-Trump debate. Um, I don't think there was a gish galloping moment there. I don't think anyone accused anyone of that. So I don't know. But yeah, it's an interesting phrase. But you can see it in practice, though, in the sense of the way that this administration has carried out so much so quick. And that would be one of my criticisms of them is that some of the things that they're doing, they have the right to do. It's just you can question them on their haste, right? Certainly what Doge is doing, what Elon Musk and his people are doing in terms of going into various buildings, agencies, and either shutting them down or going through all their records, going through all the codes, laying off employees, or not laying off. Some employees were terminated, but many were furloughed. Was why does it have to be done so quickly? Why, why is it being done so hastily? Why not after 6 months you've had a review and this is what you're doing? But obviously they feel haste is part of their necessity.
Well, and that's what Matt was talking about. If this is going to occur, moving into this new financial system, it would likely be in the next 2 years. That this would all happen during the Trump administration. And
Yeah.
I'll send it to you. And be curious
Yeah.
what you think
Yeah. No, I
about
look
it.
forward to hearing that. Yeah.
But do you think that? I mean, they're talking about auditing the Pentagon.
And I just heard Secretary of Defense Hegseth this morning essentially say that they're going to do it. I don't know if he used the word audit. I can't remember, but he certainly spoke about going through all the books and cutting waste. Now, every Pentagon secretary says that. We'll see. We'll see. I'm part of an effort that was called Doge versus the Blob. I'm a minor part of it, but like essentially this idea that how do we get Elon Musk and his people to recognize that the biggest waste, the biggest place to chop, the biggest expenditure is in the Pentagon, and how do we get him to have that attention? I'll be happy to see it. I hope they do turn their attention to it. I hope they do to the Pentagon what they did to USAID. But I'll be surprised if it actually does happen. I think that there's too much. That's too much of expenditure of like political capital to go after the Pentagon. I'm sure some things will be cut, some things we made example of, but I don't. I'll be surprised if we see something like the F-35 program is canceled or something like that.
What would you think would be the biggest would have the biggest impact on cutting in the Pentagon that's not needed?
Oh gosh, I mean, there's a host of things. One are overseas bases. We've got 800 military bases overseas, roughly $100 billion a year to support those. Essentially, you could dramatically scale those back and not lose capabilities. Certainly, the F-35 program, which has been a huge waste. The F-35 fighter plane. The costs now are almost $200 million per plane. The General Accounting Office just came out with a revised estimate, revised analysis last summer, and that's what these things cost, about $200 million per plane from start to finish, which is how you have to calculate total program cost. That's where you're looking at. And they're an aircraft that are 50% mission capable. And the Navy and the Marine Corps variants, when you talk about full mission capabilities, so essentially doing everything the brochure says it will, it's less than 20% of the time. So you got a $200 million aircraft that less than 20% of the time actually does what it says it does. It's an aircraft that's never been really being used in combat. I mean, it's dropped bombs against people without air defenses. So it's dropped bombs over the deserts of Iraq and over Afghanistan. The Israelis used them against the Iranians last fall, but they used standoff missiles with them, so they didn't get anywhere near the Iranian missile defense systems. So we don't even know if these stealth planes even work. There's a lot of program. Meanwhile, the planes it's replacing, the F-15s, the F-18s, the F-16s, are all proven in combat. and are among the best fighter aircraft in the history of the world, not just currently. I mean, so these are aircraft that you could continue to utilize with and the idea being, of course, is that you're going to have a foreign policy that is going to steer you away from conflict, not lead you into conflict. We act as if in this country as if war is determined, as if there is no other choice, that war is an inevitability, and that's not the way. We're the only nation, I think, that really conducts itself that way. There's other areas you can cut too. There's no reason to have as many nuclear weapons as we need. I mean, the Air Force itself has done studies that show we need to have about 300 warheads to have an overkill, essentially, of deterrence. With 300 warheads, we have 3 times as many warheads as we need to end all life on the planet. You need about 100 warheads. And our warheads are anywhere from 5 to say 15 times bigger than the Hiroshima bombs, right? And 100 Hiroshima bombs are considered enough to end all life on the planet because of the nuclear winter that it could engender. So, you're looking at that way as well, too. We've got about 1,700 deployed nuclear warheads and a couple thousand in storage. What do we need those all for? Our land-based ICBMs are essentially just sitting ducks. What do we need those for? Same with the bombers. We've got our submarines, which now have the same capabilities as our land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles in terms of accuracy. We essentially could have a fleet of those and have the same deterrent capability that we have now for a fraction of the price. I mean, so there's all types of areas that you could go into and remove programs that don't work, remove programs that simply don't make sense, and then readjust the size of the force to fit with an American foreign policy and presence in the world that is not determined upon war. I think you could cut the budget in half and keep America safe. And I would argue that this level of funding makes Americans less safe because it makes us pursue foreign policies. You get into, like, I think, Michael, right, a chicken and egg thing of which comes first. Is the policy or is the spending, which drives which, right? And they're so intertwined, they're so interconnected, the policy and the spending. They're two sides of the same coin that they really can't be split apart. But if you take away one, that will, I think, necessarily drive the other into remission. And so, if you were to cut defense, military spending by a significant amount, that in turn, I think, would then pull back on militarized foreign policy. And that would make Americans safer than we are now, and certainly safer than we've been the last several decades of, a reckless policy overseas, where we're just essentially this giant stumbling throughout, parts of the world, smashing everything before us.
Well, and so as we talk here about the Pentagon and move into foreign, since Trump has taken office, he's always been, his thing is no wars, no new wars.
Right.
Do you feel, we'll talk about Russia, Ukraine first, and then we'll go over to the Middle East. Do you feel Russia, Ukraine is closer to being resolved, or where do you see that right now?
Well, I think it's the closest to being resolved in 3 years. Russia invades Ukraine in February of 2022. So almost 3 years ago, February 24th, I believe it was. It's almost 3 years ago, and this is the closest we have seen in terms of action from the United States that would lead to a cessation of this war. There certainly was the attempt in the early days of that war, February through April of 2022, of peace talks, which were nearly successful until they were essentially busted up by the Americans and the British. And the documentation and the record on that is long, exhaustive, and concrete at this point. Just had another diplomat, a Swiss diplomat, the Swiss former Swiss ambassador to Turkey, who verified that that's what occurred, that Russia and Ukraine had essentially come to an agreement on a peace deal, and the Americans and the British pulled the Ukrainians out of it. I mean, people who aren't familiar with this, you can go look it up in the New York Times, printed last spring. The New York Times even printed the whole, all the pages of the peace deal. So where we're at now is the best opportunity for peace in these last few years. And certainly what we've heard from Secretary Hegseth this morning, in Brussels yesterday, he's made it clear that the United States sees the hard reality of the war in Ukraine, that there is no possibility of Russia being militarily evicted from Ukrainian territory, and that to continue with this war, it would be just to further cause much further suffering, loss of life, destruction of Ukraine itself, as well as the danger of escalation. So we're in a place now, I think, where we'll have to see how Volodymyr Zelensky and the Ukrainians react to this. Many Europeans are upset about this because many Europeans have staked their identities, have put an enormous amount of political capital into supporting the Ukraine war. But I think there's also a lot of Europeans who are breathing a sigh of relief that Donald Trump is doing this, that Donald Trump is moving forward to end it. Now, there's no guarantee that this will go forward. I'm afraid that the Americans will go into negotiations with the Russians and demand certain things. But from which is the way that Americans oftentimes negotiate, that our preconditions are what the ultimate results of the negotiation will be. But this understanding that's being presented by the Trump administration that there is no way for a military victory, that there is no way to evict Russia from Ukrainian land, leads me to believe that I think the Americans are going into this fairly clear-eyed. And while, things can break down for a number of reasons, the Russians certainly have their own incentives and what they want to see occur. The possibilities here for peace are really great. Now, the other side of it, though, is that the men and women who composed Trump's administration, by and large, with a few exceptions, if Trump was not president, they would be committed to keeping this war going. So that's my fear, is that if the negotiations are not successful, and Donald Trump has given it like 100-day window to get these things done, that on the 101st day, then those who are proposing the continuation of the war get their way. And even the plans that are in place, or the plans that are put forward by the Americans, include things that the Russians would not accept. Such as the presence of peacekeepers, ultimately Ukraine joining NATO at some point in a distant future. I mean, some other, there may be things in there that the Russians say, absolutely not, we're not going to go along with this. And then at that point, it reverts back to what Trump has also said, that he will continue providing weapons to Ukraine, and there would be this relationship with Ukraine and so on and so forth. So we'll see. I mean, the thing that occurred yesterday, I believe, was there was going to be this deal between the U.S. and Ukraine for trade in rare earth minerals. The Trump administration has demanded that the Ukrainians pay back the money the U.S. is giving Ukraine. They said they could do that through rare earth minerals and rare earth metals trade. And our Treasury Secretary supposedly had an agreement drawn up already that Volodymyr Zelensky rejected yesterday in terms of that. So things could sour on that end as well, in terms of the U.S. continuing to provide support for Ukraine if the Ukrainians don't act in the way that the Trump administration would like them to. So certainly, Michael, I know it's very long-winded, but certainly we're in a good spot, or a better spot, I should say, than we've been in 3 years, because we've got an American administration willing to see peace, willing to negotiate, willing to make concessions, not seeing this war as a proxy war with this desire to cause regime change in Russia, which is what the Biden administration saw. So just for that alone, that this administration, at least the president, doesn't view it that way, we're in a much better place. And so hopefully negotiations will go forward, and that in a few months' time, there'll be a negotiated settlement to this war.
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges, I mean, Zelensky isn't even a legitimate president. I mean, he suspended elections last year. So, and I thought Putin's been really adamant of not dealing with an illegitimate president. So it's like, how do you even
Yeah, that stuff they can gloss over. They can get over it. The fact is too, the Russians are clear they don't want to talk to the Ukrainians because the Ukrainians are the American proxy. Yeah, and this is the same thing we had in Afghanistan. The Taliban did not want to negotiate with the Karzai and then the Ghani governments in Kabul because they saw them as simply puppets, which is what they were, right? So essentially, that's what the Russians are saying. We are going to negotiate with the Americans. We're not going to negotiate with the Ukrainians, and the Americans will take care of the Ukrainians. Now, you have the issue of the Ukrainians saying we're not going to go along with it, which certainly you could have that. You could have this, you can imagine this scenario where the Americans and the Russians come to a deal and the Ukrainians say no. And then the Americans say, fine, we're walking away from this. We're not going to support you any longer. And then you have, the Europeans, they continue to support Ukraine on its own. Does Ukraine try and continue to fight Russia without American support? Is there a coup or some type of uprising or collapse or fracture within Ukraine that causes it to fall into a civil war or into, some type of failed state status because of that? I mean, because that's one of the things here I think that the Russians are really concerned about, Michael, is ensuring that Ukraine doesn't become a failed state. The Russians don't want to see Ukraine collapse. They don't want that victory, right? Their goal has never been to conquer all of Ukraine. Their goal has never been to occupy all of Ukraine. They don't want that. They don't want to be put in a position to try and do that. I don't even think they would try and do that. They would just let it go. But the problem being for them is they now would then have a failed state, on their out their front door or side door or back door, whichever way you want to look at it. Uh, in that way that Ukraine now resembles Afghanistan or Syria, so to speak, and the Russians do not want that. So I think the Russians have a lot of concern about how this will be handled in the sense of making sure the Ukrainians do go along with it. Because I also believe that Donald Trump is right. The Russians do not want a continuation of this war. They'll continue to do it. They're not going to stop, but they would prefer to have a cessation where they are now with the goals having been achieved by them, than to continue this war indefinitely. But yeah, you're right though about Zelensky. I mean, he should have had elections a year ago. You hear that talk from the Americans about pushing for elections in Ukraine. There's no certainty that Zelensky would win re-election. He's not very popular anymore. And so what would come from that? So for his own self-preservation, Zelensky has not wanted elections. I mean, they could have held those elections. I mean, you just don't hold them in the areas that Russia's occupying, but they still could have done it. I mean, whether you have elections that are not fully that are not as full or they don't extend through all of Ukraine because of the war, whether you have elections that are complete shams, or whether you have no election, what's the difference then? I mean, like, so you essentially have an illegitimate president here. So to that point, like I said, the Russians have been clear, though, that they don't want to negotiate with him. He's a puppet. He's a proxy. We want to negotiate with who's in charge. And that's what's going to happen.
So what is your? I'm holding you to this as well.
Yeah.
Whatever your prediction is, I'm gonna come back and say, look what Matt said. Where do you see this thing playing out as we sit here today, February 13th?
I think the negotiations will occur, and I think that what you would, I should say it more what I would like, what I'm optimistic for. I think because who knows what's going to happen, but what I'm optimistic for is the negotiations go forward. A deal is hammered out that essentially ends the fighting, brings about a ceasefire, is a deal that the Ukrainians can live with, that the Europeans can live with as well, that the Russians feel that their needs have been met, and that, you know, and what would that look like? I mean, I think it looks like as if you have a cessation of fighting on the front lines. You have a neutral Ukraine that has security guarantees from other nations, and it's poised in it's described as similar to what was done with Austria during the Cold War, which was essentially what has been the argument all along for a neutral Ukraine, is to base it on how Austria was neutral during the Second World War, which was very successful. That the Europeans who are angry about this are still able to say that we stood up to the tyrant. We stood up to the tyrant Vladimir Putin, and we stopped him. He wasn't able to conquer all of Ukraine, even though conquering all of Ukraine was never his goal. The Europeans can at least say that, right? I mean, so that everybody gets something that they can point to and say, look, we did this at least. And for NATO, even though Ukraine isn't doesn't become a member of NATO, NATO in some form is a guarantor of security for Ukraine, and so this way, this allows the NATO to have Ukraine as a reason for being. Right, that Ukraine, the idea of still having this alliance to prevent further Russian aggression becomes their reason to be. It just as it is now. And so everyone gets something out of it. Everyone can point to something and say, we did this, we got that. And I think that's what you're going to have in order to get buy-in. Because what I think the Ukrainians are going to be looking for is going to be, they're going to be unhappy with it. Zelensky is going to feel that a deal like this will see him removed from power. So they're going to look for anyone who's going to support them. And I think you have to make sure that for the Europeans at least, there's enough in it that they can point to and say, yes, this is a good deal for us as well. Not what we want, but it's a good deal that we won't continue to go on and further support the Ukrainians in this fight against Russia. I mean, it's a similar what happens in Afghanistan when the Taliban take power and Amr al-Saleh and others within the Afghan government say we're going to continue to fight the Taliban, and they take to the hills, they go up to the Panjshir Valley, and no one is supporting them, right? That was a fear go back 3.5 years ago when the Taliban take power, is that you're going to have a continuation of the war, just the sides are flipped now. The Taliban are the government in power, and now you've got an insurgency against them. And what happened was no one supported the would-be insurgents, and these are the people who came right out. This was the people. Amr al-Saleh was the vice president of Afghanistan. He at one point had been in charge of the intelligence agency, and so on and so forth. So these were well-recognized, powerful people with a lot of friends in the world who already had militarized forces, already had militias and armies and intelligence services, and they weren't able to get any international support because the deal had been made, the deal had been cut. Nations saw clearly that this was not going to work, and that's what I think you have to happen in Ukraine, is that whatever comes out of these negotiations, it has to be such that there's no other viable pathway forward for anyone to do anything different than what the settlement is. And then what happens with Zelensky and those in power. We'll see. I mean, I think the argument has to be made that he needs to be kept in power so that you don't have a collapse, you don't have a vacuum, you don't have a fight for power. I think, of course, you have to have elections at some point. But in the short term, I think you keep Zelensky in power just to keep everyone satiated for the moment and allow that transition away from war to occur. That's what I'm optimistic for. What actually will happen, I don't know. Very easy for us to be in the same position we're in now a year from now, right? It's very easy if these things fall through or if these negotiations don't happen for us to be exactly where we are. Maybe the Russians are 100 kilometers further west than they are now, but no, both sides are still fighting. Ukraine essentially just because of it's being kept afloat by Western cash and Western assistance. The Russians because they've built out an economy and an industrial base and built relationships with partners around the world and so on and so forth that have allowed them to sustain this war and do well. Anyone who says that Russia has not proven themselves in this war simply has an agenda or a bias or a chauvinism about this, and they're not being objective. The Russians have clearly shown that they're able to wage a war against the entire West, if not in terms of against the entire West's militaries, but certainly against the Western economies, against the Western industry, and come out on top essentially. And that's something that has to be respected and understood. Yeah. So, but yeah, I mean, I just, like I said, without this settlement, without these negotiations, we're in the same place. At best, we're in the same place, a year from now as we are now. Again, maybe the Russians being a little farther west, but the danger being, of course, that there has been a collapse in Ukraine. That the Ukrainian government has fallen, the economy has imploded. There's millions, millions more refugees all throughout Europe and in Russia, causing greater instability, causing greater economic distress, as well as the fact that you have a collapsed state that now may resemble Syria or Afghanistan. You have these Ukrainian generals that have become warlords, essentially. I mean, that's the horror that we could be in, 6 months from now, a year from now, if the negotiations aren't successful.
I can't believe that hasn't occurred up to this point with 3 years of fighting. I mean, what is Kiev like?
What's it like in the
I-
sense of,
Like the bombing, and I mean,
oh, I mean, certainly they've endured a lot of the hardships they've endured. The Russians haven't, I think on a scale of 1 to 10, on a dial of 1 to 10, the Russians have essentially kept their warfare with Kyiv at maybe like a 5.5, a 6, maybe a 6.5 at times. They've never really cranked the dial all the way up. They certainly have gone after Ukrainian infrastructure, particularly electrical and energy infrastructure, that has made things very difficult for the Ukrainians. But and they haven't gone after Ukrainian society, say the way the Israelis have gone after Palestinian society in Gaza, right? So they haven't gone with that all-out war, total war that we've seen the Israelis conduct against the Palestinians in Gaza. But it's been hard, and of course the losses for Ukraine in the sense of the battlefield losses have been immense. Whether the deaths or injured, as well as those who've deserted, those who fled the country. Millions of people have become refugees. I think more than 10 million, I think is the number, are refugees. Millions more, 10 million have left the country. Millions more internally displaced. So, economically, an incredibly difficult place to be in to deal with that. So yeah, things are very difficult for the Ukrainians. At the same time, too, I think most Ukrainians have wanted to fight on because they were invaded, and that's something you can understand. And for the Ukrainians, I think you make the arguments that the Russians were provoked. The Russians saw this, as the war that they need to fight in order to avoid a war in the future that they don't want to fight. That they saw this as a real national security interest. I think that falls flat on Ukrainian ears, and that's understandable. That's understandable. If I was Ukrainian, I probably have a different perspective on this than I do here as an American. I wouldn't be nearly as able to be objective about it. But you have seen over time that the Ukrainians have been more receptive to the idea of negotiations. You go back a couple of years, the public was mostly against the idea of negotiations, and now you have a majority of Ukrainians who want negotiations, and some of them are willing to give up territory to see peace. Not all of them, but some of them. So you do have most Ukrainians have now rejected the idea that we're going to fight on until we win. But most Ukrainians also still hold on to the idea that we want all of our land back. This idea of a settlement may be a hard pitch to the Ukrainians. At the same time, it will bring about a relief to the stress and the stress of the war, certainly the dangers of the war. There are men going off and not coming home, or there are men going off and coming home without arms and legs, or what have you. So yeah, but it has been incredibly difficult for the Ukrainians. And it's exposed a lot of fractures in their society, a lot of issues within their society. Certainly, whether it's kind of issues you see anywhere in the world, issues between the rural and the urban. You hear a lot of reports how there's folks in the rural area, they're the ones who are getting drafted. Meanwhile, people in urban areas aren't. You hear different things like that. But certainly, it's exposed the corruption, the graft, the greed. So there is a lot in Ukrainian society uh, these last 3 years that have to be reckoned with at the close of the war, because it has upset the society so much.
I was actually on a podcast yesterday, and we were talking about 2025 and where we think things are going, and what my concerns are in regards to foreign policy. And I agree, everything you said with Russia, Ukraine. I mean, time will tell, but I hate the word hope, but I am hopeful or
Yeah.
optimistic that that will get resolved. My concern, though, is what's going on in the Middle East, and you know, President Trump put a deadline on, I think it was Saturday at noon, this Saturday at noon, that all the Israeli hostages, whatever hostages are left, are going to need to be returned. And he's been talking about buying Gaza, but now it's not buying Gaza. Now it's taking over Gaza, which I have to share the country that we're in today. We can go to Gaza, take that over, but you can't go to L.A. You can't enter in your property right now in L.A., but you still have to pay your property taxes. Isn't that amazing? We can say, "Oh, we're taking over a land, in the Middle East," but you can't go on your property in California.
Well, I think
So,
there's some congruity with that because I think it's this idea of the sovereignty of the government, right? The sovereignty, the imperial aspects of our government, whether it be overseas or domestic, right? It's ours. I mean, I know when Trump was asked about how are you gonna take it? Well, under what law are you gonna take it? He said just U.S. law, under our law. Like he seemed almost perplexed that he was being asked that question, as if there was any question to our authority to do whatever. And certainly, I think what you're talking about with L.A., this idea of like, well, regardless of whether or not you're burnt out or not, you still have to render unto Caesar what's Caesar's.
so, what were your thoughts when you heard him talking about we're just going to take over Gaza?
I, Michael, I think like I know that several people did this who've told me this, and probably a lot of folks who are listening. I rewound it. I was watching the press conference and I rewound it. Watching the stream and went back and did I hear that right? And I went back, I rewound it the second time. I couldn't believe what I heard. I mean, it was shocking that that level of support by the U.S. to Israel was being presented. And the appreciation for it by the Israelis is immense. I mean, their gratitude is enormous over this. I actually have it still sitting here. I'll read it because I had printed it out for something else I had to do. But this was Benjamin Netanyahu's comments on Monday after he got back to Israel from his trip to the U.S. Netanyahu said, "This trip and the conversations we held with the President of the United States included additional incredible achievements that can guarantee security of Israel for generations. I am not exaggerating. I'm not overstating. There are opportunities here for possibilities that I don't think we ever dreamed of, or at least until the last few months. They didn't seem possible, but they are possible." So I think I, I was shocked. Many of us were shocked by the boldness, the brazenness of it, the how incredible this idea was. It just didn't seem possible, even to be suggested. And then I think whether he is being literal or figurative in terms of taking over Gaza, I think the important thing is what we see in Netanyahu's comments. The understanding that the United States will do whatever Israel wants it to do. You saw this at play in the first night in office. Donald Trump is signing executive orders, and he's asked by reporters about whether or not the ceasefire will hold. And he answers, he says, "It's not. I don't know. It's not our war. It's their war." And so I really do think he has given full blessing to the Israelis to do what they want, as if they are a subordinate of the United States, as if they are one of his delegates, one of his an arm of his own administration, as just as he would with Secretary Rubio or Secretary Hegseth or Attorney General Bondi, saying whatever you need, go ahead and do it. I'm here for you, right? Like any good boss is supposed to do. Right. And so that's the relationship I really see with Israel and the U.S. now. And so that is quite frightening because that gives the Israelis carte blanche to go past things that normally they might hold back on because they don't have the wherewithal, the resources, the ability to do it themselves. So, when you see this, when Netanyahu saying this, like, there are opportunities here for possibilities I don't think we ever dreamed of. Like, what are they talking about? I mean, they've been dreaming about annexing the West Bank for generations now. They've been dreaming about wiping out the people from Gaza for generations now. They've been dreaming about attacking and destroying Iran for how long, right? I mean, how many decades have we seen Benjamin Netanyahu with that little picture of the bomb with the fuse on it, saying this is Iran's nuclear capability. This is why we have to go and destroy the Iranians now. I mean, how many, 30 years we've been seeing that for? 25 at least. So, okay, what is Netanyahu talking about? What possibilities are there that they had never dreamed of? Now, in the fact that he makes a point of saying, I'm not exaggerating, I'm not overstating. Okay, some things were decided here, some things were agreed upon, at least in Netanyahu's mind, of where the U.S. and Israel will go together in the Middle East. And this is why I'm with you, very afraid for what may come, very afraid for what these possibilities might be.
Let me ask you a couple things with Gaza, because you're somebody that spent a quite amount of time, good amount of time over there. First of all, they're using the number 1.7, 1.8 million people that are still alive. I find that incredible, Matt, because I've never been there, but how the hell are these people? How have they survived since October of 23? So how are these people? How are there that many people that are alive?
It is amazing. I think that the numbers. So the pre October 7th, 2023 population was 2.2 to 2.3 million, different estimates. And you've seen, I think that, well, the authority in Gaza is saying 61,000 dead, and I think most everyone agrees that that's an undercount, that that's the baseline number. And the way they do that, the way the authorities in Gaza put out their number of dead, the 61,000 number, which they raised from 48,000 just a couple weeks ago, which essentially at that point what they said was that these people are listed as missing. They've been listed as missing for months, more than a year now. They're dead, right? So we're going to bump them into the killed category, and so 61,000. I think most people recognize that that's the baseline. And again, the way that the authorities in Gaza go about that is those are ones that are confirmed, right? Those are ones that, for the most part, bodies have been brought into morgues, or bodies have been brought before the authorities there, the health authorities there, and a death certificate essentially has been signed off on. That doesn't include the many, many more missing who no one could ever report them missing because everyone is gone. I mean, the numbers are staggering. You've had 2,100 families in Gaza completely eliminated. 2,100 families, as they describe it, taken from the records. So 2,100 families where there's no one of that blood anymore who's still alive, completely destroyed. You have others that I think close to 5,000, 4,800 families where there's only one survivor, many a times that it being a child. So people are familiar with that term they've come up with, wounded child, no surviving family, WCNSF, right? I mean, so the horror of this, the scale of it, with the numbers and statistics we have, we're just, I think, appreciating tip of the proverbial iceberg, right? In the sense that we just don't know how many are dead, haven't been accounted for. And as time goes on, that number will increase, as well as, there's some confliction about this, but for the most part, the deaths put forward by the Gaza authorities are combat deaths, are traumatic deaths, are deaths caused directly by Israel. And so that those deaths that are indirect causes of indirect consequences of war have not been fully accounted for. And that's for those who have died because of illness, because of malnutrition, they've been starved to death. I shouldn't say it in a way that's an accident. No, the Israelis directly starved them to death. The people who died from the cold, from immiseration, from those sorts of things, number many times more than those who are directly killed by Israeli bombs and bullets. We know that because that's the way war works, right? So, in war, you have normally 2 to 4 times as many indirect deaths as you do direct deaths, right? So if you have a war, the population endures many times more casualties from, again, hunger, exposure, illness than they do from bombs and bullets. So the fact that you're looking at this number and say if you go that there's uh, 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 that many still alive is a testament to the Palestinian people. But we also don't know just how great the scale of loss actually has been, and that loss, of course, will continue because many people who are suffering now, many people who have been wounded, who have been sickened, who have been immiserated over the course of the last 16 months, they will continue to die because of that. So yeah, how they survived, it really is a story that I think will be told, through novels and films, and because it is again, the only word I can come to is a testament to the strength of the Palestinian people that they endured. Um, Now they're still there, and what will Israel do about them? And certainly with the blessing and the backing of the United States, they can do whatever they want. And so I think it's a question of just not if, but when will Israel resume its campaign against the Palestinians in Gaza? How will that be factored into their campaign that they've begun to annex the West Bank? Can they do both at once? I think most of us would have said a couple of weeks ago, no, it's impossible. They can't do both at once. They just don't have the ability to do so. But if they have this backing from the U.S. as they do now, then maybe they can carry out their genocide in Gaza, as well as conduct their annexation of the West Bank concurrently, because they have this support, again, support that Netanyahu says he never dreamed of from the U.S. And so what does that mean? And I think that's a really big question, is what does it actually mean? When Donald Trump's been asked about, the first night he spoke about this, and he was asked about U.S. soldiers being in Gaza, he said, we'll do whatever's necessary. And then, of course, his people the next day walked that back. Oh, he didn't commit to that. It's just options are on the table, et cetera, et cetera. But in the last week and a half or so, last 8, 9 days, Donald Trump has not backed down at all from his commitment to take over Gaza. And as you said, he was talking about buying it. And now he's just saying we're going to take it over. And what does that mean? What does take over mean? At one point, he did say the Israelis would give it to us when they were done with the war, meaning, okay, the Israelis are going to ethnically cleanse it and then give it to us. But I don't know. I don't think anyone really knows, and it's a question as to whether or not the president actually has a clear idea of what he's talking about. Other than that, he fully committed to supporting the Israelis and doing whatever they need to do, and this is how he's going to message it.
Do you envision that they'll be successful in this? Because to your point as well, and coming back to the Taliban, you can bomb, they bombed Afghanistan, every which way, and you can't get rid of those people. Not those people. You can't get rid of them. And I'm saying this in a positive way. I'm not saying this in a negative way.
Yeah, no,
so
no.
Don't interpret it like that.
The best pop culture example I have, Michael, is at the beginning of Gladiator. If people remember, the Russell Crowe film from 25 years ago or
Great
whatever.
Movie.
And, yeah, great movie, right? I haven't seen the second one. I don't know how that.
Can I do a side note really quick? A little bit
yeah.
of just a light moment. They were talking about the second one, and they asked, and I didn't see it. I heard it was terrible, but they said that Russell Crowe. They asked him about it, his take on the second one, like if he's involved. He goes, "If you saw the end of the first one, man, I got nothing to do with it."
That's good. At least you don't know. At least I know there's no Russell Crowe ghost cameo.
No Obi-Wan. No Obi-Wan.
Yeah, right. So, but in the beginning of Gladiator, they're up in Germany, and they're fighting the barbarians, the Romans, and the one Roman general turns to Russell Crowe's character, and he says something along the lines of "Why don't these people know when they've been beaten?" Right? And Russell Crowe turns back to them and says, "Would you know? Would you, essentially saying, would you admit defeat? Would you surrender?" And that's what we're dealing with here. I think a lot of it is essentially put yourself in your shoes. What would you do? I mean, particularly when you have lineage and ancestry. The Palestinians talk about this. They say we've endured 20 empires. We'll endure 21. We'll endure 21. In the same way that the Afghans would say we are the graveyard of empires. We've seen everyone from Alexander to the Americans here, and we're like so. Not only do you have what's an essential aspect of the human spirit, an essential element of our human experience, this desire for liberation, this willingness to resist. It's coupled by a very real history of not just ancient history, but modern history, where my fathers resisted, my grandfathers resisted, my great grandfathers resisted. I will resist. Now, what I will say though, having just been there in Palestine in November, is that you do see a lot of hopelessness. You do see a lot of forlornness. It's not defeatism, it's not surrender, but it's acceptance of what's coming. And what you hear then is from many Palestinians about wanting to get particularly their children out, right? Because they know what's coming. And you said it before, and I agree with you, Michael. Like I kind of hate the word hope. When you're up against the steel and the iron of Israel and the United States, what are you talking about hope? I mean, so I think what you have is you'll have many in, say, Gaza, in the supply of West Bank as well, who will resist, and they'll resist to the end, and it will be bloody and it will be awful. But there'll be others who will, if given the opportunity, leave because they have children and they don't want their children to die, right? I mean, so I think we can put ourselves in their shoes and understand it both ways. I had the year before I graduated college, Ted Koppel did the commencement address at my college. This was 1994, and Koppel, so just 50 years after the Holocaust. And Koppel talked about how if you were, he talked about the benefits of pessimism. And in terms of if you're going to be objective, if you're going to be a realist, you have to accept and embrace pessimistic views at times. And what he spoke about was that if you were a Jew in Europe in 1934 or 35 or 36, and you were a pessimist, you and your family survived because you got out of Europe, right? You found a way out. You right. If you're an optimist, if you believed in hope that things were going to get better, right, et cetera, you and your family perished. I mean, so I think that's some of the thinking for many of the Palestinians. And I heard this from those children of like, I've got to get my kids out. And so it's a terrible, terrible situation. It's horrific. I think Israel's goal for Gaza has always been resettlement eventually, but more point, just getting rid of those people. It's not a priority for them in terms of annexation as the West Bank is. And this is the way I could see almost, this is my thoughts on it going back a month or so, was that up until the ceasefire, and then the Israelis allowing the Palestinians in Gaza to go back north, really changed things because it upended Israel's goals, it upended Israel's policies there, what they've been carrying out to cleanse the northern part of Gaza. So up until the ceasefire, my thoughts were that they would continue the cleanse to continue to remove the Palestinians from the northern parts of Gaza, push them into the central and southern points, and then worry about those people later and just immiserate them, continue to bomb them, make life horrible, horrible for them, carry out the genocide that way. But that the priority was the northern parts of Gaza, and they would begin to resettle it and so forth. Now, in order to go to that, now the Israelis have to remove hundreds of thousands of people once again from the northern parts of Gaza, and that's going to require a lot of effort. They'll do it, of course, but the idea being of what is their ultimate goal there. And I think this is why they're so determined to get Egypt or Jordan or some other place to take in the Palestinians from Gaza, and that too would then be extended to the West Bank, because they do know that some will leave, not all, but some will leave because, of course, they have their children. What are you going to do? I mean, so where we're at in terms of what's coming, just for Gaza, but then for Palestine and the greater Middle East. Completely different attitude I have than, say, as we were just discussing, what's happening in Eastern Europe and Europe in general, where I see the chance for possibly something good to occur.
Yeah, it's amazing. You go from two parts of the world, one to the potential, the opportunity for de-escalation, and then the other side of it is it looks now maybe there's something that'll happen that we don't see coming. Maybe Trump goes and makes a deal with Iran. Israel will be pissed, and this whole thing will de-escalate. I don't know.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah. I mean, it's. I wish, certainly wish there was a consistency here where the Trump administration was approaching the Middle East the way they're approaching Europe. But there's certainly not that. And I think I'm really afraid with regards to Iran that maybe Iran was the piece that Netanyahu's talking about when he talks about the possibilities. Never dream of it. Was that because the Iranians for the Iranian, I mean, so for the Israelis, the West Bank has always been their priority, right? That's always been the jewel that they want to acquire. Everything else is supporting effort. Everything else is secondary. And so the way I think a lot of Americans look at it, we look at Iran as being Israel's first concern. And it's not. The Palestinians are. The West Bank is among the Palestinians. And but the desire to hobble Iran, to get their pound of flesh from Iran. I mean, this is something that has been a talking point. I don't want to say talking point because that makes it sound cheap, but has been an important, very important thing for Netanyahu and the Likud party and others in Israel for decades. And for the Americans, of course, Iran has been the great white whale. I mean, for many, many Americans, Iran has been the ultimate enemy, has been the what they obsess over. And so you have this moment in the press conference between Netanyahu and Trump where they do speak about how Iran will never be allowed to have a nuclear weapon, which is standard boilerplate stuff from the Americans and the Israelis. But that coming after the remarks on Gaza and Palestine, following up on everything we've seen the last week and a half with regards to Trump's remarks, Netanyahu's remarks, it makes me think that a joint American-Israeli attack on Iran is not a possibility, it's an eventuality. And it's something that will come about just whenever the timing is right for both sides. Then it will be carried out. And so that's what I'm really afraid of. The Israelis. There's a thing today. Was it in the Wall Street Journal? I haven't read it yet. I just heard about it in a headline about how the assessment from the Biden administration was that Israel will carry out an attack on Iran this year. And of course, I think there's no question about whether the Trump. I think there's some question. I should say it differently. I think there should be a question as to whether or not the Trump administration will go along with it. Maybe it's more of a question of how much will they go along with it. The big thing for Israel, for American support, I think, is getting our B-2s and our B-2 stealth bombers, having them involved, because they're the aircraft that can carry those 30,000-pound bunker buster bombs that they believe is necessary to hit the Iranian nuclear research facilities that are buried underground or under mountains. So I think that's the big get for them, why they want us so bad, because we have capabilities, the U.S. has capabilities that the Israelis don't. And Israelis know that, yeah, we can continue to fly our aircraft over there, fire missiles at them from standoff ranges, weapons that have 500 to 1,500 pound warheads that essentially aren't going to do much to protected targets. This is why we need the Americans to come in with their B-2s and their 30,000 pound bunker busters to really do the job. Whether we've seen such mixed messages from the Americans from Trump on this, saying how he doesn't want a war, but certainly the people he surrounded himself are people who seem like they do. They've been saying it for a long enough time. So this is kind of one of those things where we just don't know, and we're going to have to kind of wait and see how it's carried out, because there still is an awful lot of dust in the region in terms of understanding what's occurring. But some of it is clear now, but the big uncertainty is what exactly are these undreamt of possibilities that Netanyahu is talking about.
You got time for two short questions?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Do you think Gaza will become Vietnam in terms of getting, they will not be successful annexing these people, annexing I hate to say these people, so I keep correcting myself because doesn't
Right.
sound
Yeah, I
right
know
the
what
way
you
I'm
mean.
wording it. But you know where I'm going.
I don't know if they're serious about annexing it and pushing them out. Um, they can do it. It's just where they're going to go to, and so we'll see what the Arab states do. Um, certainly the comments from King Abdullah when he met with President Trump um, were somewhat agreeable. He didn't say we're going to support this, but he said we're going to present a plan and everything else. And it wasn't the firm no. It wasn't the firm, it wasn't the defiance I think a lot of people wanted to see. And of course, you've seen, the Arab states be defiant on Twitter and things like that and their press statements. But in terms of what are they actually going to do, we'll see. So if there's a place to push the Palestinians out to, say, I think the example I think most people have in their head is just a massive tent camp in the Sinai, which is essentially what the Biden administration wanted to do as well. So these arguments that Trump is doing something more than Biden. If Biden had if Egypt had agreed to let people out of Gaza, the Biden administration would have fully supported that. They actually have money in the budget to support building such a tent city in the Sinai for the Palestinian people being cleansed from Gaza. So the Biden administration was on board with this as well. But the idea being, if they're able to do that, then essentially what the Israelis get online, get their infantry and their armor online, and just bomb everything ahead of them and push south and kill everything that doesn't, leave from them. And then you're looking at, a scale of killing greater than what we've seen the last 16 months. And that's possible. That's possible. If an accommodation is made with Egypt, accommodation is made with Jordan, somehow some deal is struck with them. We'll see. I mean, I don't trust King Abdullah or Sisi anymore, or General Sisi in Egypt any more than I do trust Netanyahu or Trump. So, certainly, if that's not there, though, and it's just a question of destroying the Palestinians who are trapped in Gaza, then certainly that can go on for years. The Israelis will be able to do so for as long as the Trump administration is in power. And I think then the idea being is that they get to a point where things are just normalized, it's back to business, and everyone goes on with themselves after 2 or 3 years of this. I think that's essentially what it is. You got a couple of years, 2, 3 years to carry out what you want to carry out. And after that, go back to business, go back to usual. And then, of course, even if a Democratic administration comes in to replace Trump's administration, they're not going to make any fuss about what occurred, just as long as everything is kind of kept quiet and it's back to business. So I think that's ultimately what the arc of it will be. Just a question of what does it look like in that space of trying to cleanse Gaza again. Whether, again, the Arab states will go along with it to some degree, which I know a lot of people are saying, no, they won't. It will collapse their countries, their people will rise up. I don't know. I don't know if that's the case. I don't know if that would actually be what would happen. And then, what would the actual cleansing look like? How would they accomplish it? But certainly they were successful. They removed most of the population from northern Gaza, south of what was called the Netzarim corridor, which splits northern Gaza from central and southern Gaza. They moved most of the population south of that. They were successful in that. It took them several months. They started in August and they were doing it up until a ceasefire. So it took them many months to do that. But can they do it again? Yeah, sure. Why not? Can they do it to the whole strip? Yeah, eventually they can, as long as they have a place to push the people out to.
The last question regards to Syria. Does Syria play into any of this at all, or what? Or Turkey?
Certainly, Turkey and Israel are on a line of conflict, or on a heading that they are will eventually seriously butt heads, as opposed to just the rhetoric we've seen from the Turks over the last couple months. Supposedly, I mean, just one example. Supposedly, the Turks are allowing the Iranians to send weapons to Hezbollah through Turkey now, right? Which is something that did not occur before. It wasn't needed. The Iranians sent weapons through Syria to Hezbollah. So if those reports are true, you're seeing a pretty fundamental shift, right? So this relationship between Turkey and Iran could expand, but with regards to Syria, um, how Israel has taken a chunk of Syrian territory greater than what they possessed before, because they possessed the Golan Heights, which they annexed in the 70s. And then in the last several months, they pushed forward out of that, took further land in Syria, including up along the Lebanese border. And they're building it out with military positions now. They don't seem like they're intent on giving it back. In the immediate term, will the new Syrian government continue to be okay with that? They seem to be at this point. There has been some issues, but nothing as dramatic as what's occurring between Syria and Lebanon right now, where you have Syrian forces, fighting with former Syrian government forces and sympathetic Hezbollah forces along the border there. The Syrian government actually closed off a lot of the roads in between Syria and Lebanon. It used to be fairly open. Turkey, of course, has HTS, which took over Damascus. They're essentially a Turkish operation. I don't think it's too much to say that. And at some point, will the Turks' ambitions run into what Israel wants to see done? We'll see. We'll see. The Israelis certainly feel this way. They had a few weeks ago, the Knesset, members of the Knesset started a committee. The members of the Israeli parliament started the committee to study the eventuality of a Turkish-Israeli war. So there are certainly many Israelis who see that the Turks and themselves being on the being coming into conflict. And so much of what Israel in the United States is doing is, just part of what was recommended to be done in the 90s by Project for a New American Century and the Clean Break people and all those neoconservatives, that you got to essentially rebuild the Middle East in order to make sure Israel has primacy. And as we see Turkey's ambitions grow, not just to be the paramount power in the Middle East, but to be a world power, that's going to run in, you're going to have conflict. You're going to run into that. If both Israel and Turkey want to be the paramount powers within the Middle East, well, there's going to be conflict. And that says nothing about what do the Saudis want to do and what do the Iranians want to do. So the potential for regional clashes here is incredibly great. It's incredibly great, and this is why this whole idea that what has occurred the last 16 months in Gaza may just be a prelude or a prologue to what is coming is something that I think a lot of people have taken seriously.
Well, and with Turkey as well. I mean, you're talking about a whole different game here because they're part of NATO, but yet they're predominantly Muslim. And can this occur? If this, if it's inevitable of a clash, will that happen while Erdogan is still in power? Because he's not a young man.
No, and again, the Turks have ambitions beyond the Middle East. They have historical reasons for this, but certainly their geographical placement, right? As the bridge between Asia and Europe, they take that very seriously. And so I think you're going to see the Turks. I think what the Turks want to do is to become a necessary partner for a number of countries that are not necessarily allied themselves, right? So making themselves indispensable, but also powerful, so that when it comes to dealing with other nations, they have a role to play. So in Erdogan, I think he probably goes to bed at night sometimes thinking he could be the next Saladin, right? That he can be the man who reunites the Muslim world. And his rhetoric, certainly against the Israelis, has been, it's his rhetoric is clear at times. And so, yeah, I mean, the Turks are a growing power, a power that can't be dismissed for many reasons, including just where they're located on the map. And they understand that. And I think they see the shifting world. They see a shift in terms of the dynamics of the decline of the American empire, the loss of American hegemony, the rise of other powers, the rise of other institutions, the rise of other possibilities. And so I think they'll try and play all those off if possible. So you will see a Turkey that is in NATO and also a part of BRICS potentially.
Where can people find you, Matt?
I'm on Substack at Matthew Ho and on X at Matthew P Ho, P as in Patrick, and
As,
last name spelled H-O-H.
as always, thank you. Thank you so much for coming back. It's a lot to digest. And one of the things that I keep mentioning on here is, what an incredible time to be covering all this. And, things are changing so rapidly that it provides opportunities for, the work that you're doing, for me to have these conversations. And I just appreciate, you're always making yourself available for me.
Well, thank you, Michael. I enjoy doing this with you. I appreciate it.
Mic drop.